Mr. President, do you now know who the whistleblower is, sir?
Well, we're trying to find out about a whistleblower. When you have a whistleblower that reports things that were incorrect, as you know, and you probably now have figured it out, the statement I made to the president of Ukraine, a good man, a nice man, knew, was perfect. It was perfect. But the whistleblower reported a totally different statement, like the statement it was not even made.
Except the notes that you released from that perfect call corroborate the whistleblower account, not yours. Donald Trump's war with the unnamed whistleblower didn't stop there. From his Twitter feed this morning, he wrote this: "Why aren't we entitled to interview and learn everything about the whistleblower and also the person who gave all the false information to him?" That threatening question, the answer to which is relatively obvious, follows a days-long effort by the president and his allies to smear the unnamed whistleblower. Several Republicans have amplified a right-wing conspiracy theory tweeted in all caps by Donald Trump, claiming falsely that immediately before the complaint in question was filed, the intelligence community changed the rules requiring whistleblowers to have firsthand knowledge of the events they report. In a rare rebuttal, the Office of the Intelligence Community's Inspector General says, "Sorry, that is not true." From that rare response, quote, "The disclosure of urgent concern from the complainant submitted on August 12, 2019 is the same form the Intelligence Community Inspector General has had in place since May 24, 2018, which went into effect before Inspector General Atkinson entered on duty." Atkinson, of course, a Trump appointee. The Intelligence Community watchdog then added, quote, "By law, the complainant need not possess firsthand information in order to file a complaint." That rebuke from that office followed up by something of a surprise. Trump-supporting Republican Senator Chuck Grassley, the co-founder of the Senate Whistleblower Protection Caucus, later released his own statement, saying in part, "This person appears to have followed the whistleblower protection laws and ought to be heard out and protected. We should always work to respect whistleblowers' requests for confidentiality. No one should be making judgments or pronouncements without hearing from the whistleblower first and carefully following up on the facts. Everybody is here." This, to me, seems to be potentially explosive for the president. The president's attack on the whistleblower represents three things. One, his terror at how close this account hews to what has probably been going on inside this White House since the beginning. Two, how disoriented he is by where the sources came from. I mean, the whistleblower quotes other individuals. And three, the president's appointee, the watchdog that oversees these issues for the intelligence community, has gone in and interviewed those White House officials who corroborate the whistleblower account. We're almost moving beyond this being a relevant part of Trump's political defense even.
But the president loves having an adversary, and now he's got a really powerful one, and he knows it. And, you know, the whistleblower ended up providing accurate information about an act that the House is now using for the impeachment hearings. This is a very threatening adversary. And Trump's MO, as we have seen with Hillary and with others, Mueller and Comey, is to just attack and destroy the adversary. But this one he can't see. It's Casper. Mm-hmm. He can't get his hands. He doesn't know exactly the line of attack. So given the instincts of this White House, this is probably eating them up because they know how to play this game. They're good at it, but they can't play it if they don't know who they're up against, except someone who's inflicted a lot of damage on the White House.
Frank, I would surmise, I don't know this, but that if any of the whistleblowers' allegations had not borne out, the Trump appointees that run the DNI and the watchdog for the intelligence community would have made sure this didn't get so far as to threaten the impeachment of their boss, Donald J. Trump.
I think every indicator is that this is a solid whistleblower complaint, and that the time spent by the IG looking into the credibility and declaring it credible and urgent indicates that the substance is there. And I also think that we'd be hearing from Republican members of the House and or Senate Intelligence Committees by now that something's amiss with this complaint. We've not heard it. I want to take a moment, Nicole, to talk about the physical security for this whistleblower and his family, and more largely even members of the key committees here. We have a president who has targeted people verbally before, and we've seen people like Cesar Sayoc from South Florida who sent explosive packages to the people in the media and to former officials that the president was targeting. We've seen the El Paso shooter target Hispanics because the president was referring to them as invaders. I get really concerned when I hear the president drawing analogies between traitors and treasonous individuals and this whistleblower, calling people who cooperated with the whistleblower almost spies, calling members of the House savages. There are unstable people amongst us who will view that as some kind of green light to do something violent, and I'm deeply concerned, and I urge the committees in Congress to provide adequate security for their witness. He's their witness, and whether that means a Capitol Police security detail or whatever it takes, this is essential and paramount right now.
I get concerned beyond the whistleblower. You know, authoritative figures tell you what they're going to do. And his tweets when he referred to Adam Schiff and treason, and we know what the penalty for treason is, execution. And talking about a civil war, Trump is not beyond telling people to take to the streets. I mean, I don't think people comprehend him in a corner. There's no moral boundary that he would put the country, set the country on fire if it was going to in any way help him. I believe that he will at some point, if this goes down wrong for him, say they're taking your president. At this point, I can't do anything. Do what you have to do. He is capable of that. And if I had to predict he would do that, he would do it. The same way Michael Cohen said he's never leaving office. This is he's not going to stand there and wave with the helicopter behind him like Richard Nixon if this goes bad. Just let's understand the end to this. If there's an end, is not the end.
Well, he's already saying the first part, and that is they're trying to undo an election. They're trying to take, I'm your leader. This is the populism on steroids here. And he's saying they're trying to get me out because I'm fighting for you. And so he's trying to draw a reaction. Now, he hasn't explicitly gone where Donnie says he's going, but it's implicit at this point. And the question is where it goes if things get worse.
Do you think that becomes the red line for Republicans, or do you think we're just beyond the red line?
You know, there's the irony, Nicole, that the Republican Party, founded by a person who said a house divided against itself could not stand, is now standing behind this person who seems to be at least encouraging this idea of civil war, and as Donnie said, is probably setting himself up to stay if there's any kind of contested election. Look, you've seen a couple of people come out. Adam Kinzinger is one who has said this is not good, but there have been far too few voices on an issue that really should be black and white.
And you know, the polling is what they're all watching, right? You're talking about legacy, think about history. They're not looking long term. They're looking at the shortest term possible, and that's what's the president's daily approval rating? What does it mean for me? And the president's approval number dropped to 37% in one poll today. That's, I think, the low mark for his presidency so far. But it's going to have to drop below that. The
Mendoza line, I think, is 35.
So
so
it's close. But at this point, you know, this is a party that is mostly a Southern party, and Kinzinger is from Illinois. Amadei of Nevada. Right, this is not the backbone of the Republican Party. Lindsey Graham represents red South Carolina, and we've seen him stand behind the president. So the numbers, I think, have to dip a little further, perhaps.
There's one other dynamic that we should keep an eye on, and that's the Senate majority. Mitch McConnell will not lose his majority. He will not.
We'll see about that.
By the way, Lindsey Graham has only had 7 points.
We'll see about that.
You're
saying he won't run it.
Do not want to take this.
Then Mitch McConnell must have it a push pin on his little cock board with the 55% approval for the commencement of impeachment inquiries against Donald Trump in the CBS poll this summer. That was like a polling version of a political detonation when that number went out. I heard from everybody I know.
But Gene's right. This is a horrible situation for the most vulnerable Republican senators to be in. Roughly
couldn't
a year
happen
out
to a better crowd. Go ahead.
Just one more point. The other dynamic to look at is the number of House Republicans that are heading for the hills right now and are stepping down. Retiring.
Like all of Texas.
The more of them that retire, and again, some of these are coming from very red districts, but that gives them much more flexibility to speak out against Trump.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.